Hello! So it's time for my September wrap-up part 2. Those of you who saw my part 1 wrap-up, which I will link down below, will know that part 1 of September was not the greatest, and I'm in a bit of a reading time at the moment. Not gonna lie, that hasn't particularly improved, but it's got a little bit better. Like, there aren't any awful books in here. I just am a bit uninspired by reading at the moment. It's making me quite sad. I think I'm not kind of taking the time to enjoy reading as much as I normally do, which isn't helping. But also I'm just feeling uninspired. Nothing's jumping out at me that I want to read at the moment. But anyway, let's get into this. So I started with Joan Didion, The Year of Magical Thinking, which I've wanted to read for a while. I've heard quite conflicting things. A lot of people have said it's quite a sort of impersonal look at grief and it's quite removed, and that kind of put me off for a while. But actually I'm finding that non-fiction is kind of what I'm needing at the moment when I'm in this kind of reading time. It kind of is easier and just easier to just read and get myself lost in. So this one actually is probably the most successful read I had in the second part of the month. So this is about Joan Didion. Basically is a writer. I think she's more of a journalist, and she's also got a few books of essays and things, and she went through a year of her life where her daughter was in critical care. She got pneumonia and then had a brain aneurysm. During that year, Joan Didion's husband also died of a sudden heart attack, and this is basically just her look at that year and how she coped with that year. I liked this. I can see the argument that it's quite removed and it's not the most personal look at grief, but it also is at the same time, and I think it's very much about Joan Didion's way of coping with it and writing about it, I suppose, is to kind of remove herself and look at the facts of grief and the sort of figures, and it's quite an interesting look at it in that way. And also I think it kind of is a really interesting look at the ways in which we cope with things that on the surface we would just never expect to be able to cope with. I think it's lovely, it's touching, it's heartbreaking, and ultimately it's just honest. It's a really honest look at grief and the fact that sometimes she just didn't know what the hell she was doing and everything was just falling apart, but she got through it and she knew she was going to get through it. And I would definitely recommend it. Maybe not if you're going for like a really personal, touching memoir, but it's really personal and touching in its own way. I then read How the Blessed Live by Susanna M. Smith. I actually picked this up because I was like, I'm gonna love this book. So I picked it up in order to kind of boost myself. Didn't work. I actually didn't like this. I gave it 4 stars because the writing was quite beautiful, but in hindsight it's probably a 3-star. It follows sort of split perspective. We know we've got a pair of twins. We start with one of the twins. She's now run away from home and we don't really know why, and we have flashbacks to her dad who's talking to their mother who died giving birth to them, and then we sort of go to the next section and we're with the other twin and we sort of start finding out why they've become estranged, what happened. The writing in here was fine. Like, there was some beautiful writing. It had a lot of Wiccan-y, witchy stuff, which I don't think I actually like in a book. This kind of reminded me of The Scrapbook by Carly Holmes, which I read earlier in the year and really just didn't enjoy. It kind of doesn't ring true for me. I just find it all a bit silly, because it didn't really go into it, but it's just there that there's some spells and some witchy stuff happening, and I don't know, it just didn't do it for me. I felt like the character development wasn't there as well. Like, it's hard to say without spoiling anything, but there's a sort of the major plot point in this basically is an action that has been partaken by some of the characters which is highly questionable, and it is again something that I don't particularly like in books because I think it's quite hard to adequately express. But I felt as though it needed more development there. There was no character development. They did a bad thing and there's no explanation of how they felt about that thing. It just tells us that that thing happened. There's no in-depth study of how they felt about that thing, how that thing gave them guilt or whatever. Like, it just didn't go into it enough for me. It's quite short. I read it in one day. There's not much writing to a page, but yeah, I really didn't enjoy, and the more I think about it, the less I like it, to be honest. Sorry. Then I read Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. Shall we firstly just address that this is the most hideous book cover I own. I don't even know why that's a thing that would be put on the cover of a book. It's just hideous. But anyway, yeah, again, this was fine. I gave it 4 stars. I liked the writing and I liked some of the bits. Admittedly, I don't feel like I can adequately judge this because I read this at a time where I was barely reading at all. I think it took me over a week to get through, and it's not thick. So I was literally reading like 10 pages at a pop, and that's just not how I read, and that's not how I can gather a adequate idea of a book. But from what I can tell, from what I got from it, reading it that way, it was good. I liked the writing. There were some really nice observations of characters in here, but I would say that the plot was a bit lacking for me. It kind of reminded me of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who is one of my favourite writers. I love his writing, and I love his observations and his character descriptions, but his plots are always slightly lacking. That's kind of how I felt with this. Basically, this follows a man called Charles, and we start with him at university, and he meets a man called Sebastian, who lives in a house called Brideshead, which is like a big mansion basically, and the family are all a bit quirky characters, and Charles sort of just shows us the family through his observations, and then he sort of becomes estranged with them. He goes off and lives his life, but he always seems to return to them, and it kind of, there is times, it's written just before the war, and there is some really lovely bittersweet moments in there where you sort of, they know that they're going into war, and they know that this happy, sort of calming time in their lives is coming to an end, and it's sort of really quite nostalgic and sweet and lovely. I would like to reread it at some point because, as I say, the characters were great. The plot just didn't come together for me, but I think that was partly my own fault, so I will give that another go. Then, in another attempt to get myself out of this reading slump, I picked up Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert. When I was about 19, I would say, this book was everything to me, like my manual of life, basically. It was when I had just moved away from my sort of childhood town and was going through kind of a hard time, and this just kind of picked me out of that and was just wonderful. And rereading it, it's interesting, again, this experience of rereading books that you, especially books that you loved when you were younger. It sort of really shows you the divide between yourself then and yourself now. I was not prepared for how spiritual this book was going to be, and ultimately the realisation of how spiritual I was when I first read it. But anyway, so this is a memoir by Elizabeth Gilbert. I'm sure most people have either seen the film or heard of this. Basically, she breaks up from her marriage and is also coming out of the relationship that she fell into after her marriage, and she decides to just leave everything and go travelling for a year. She goes to Italy, India and Indonesia, and it's just about her travels, really, and also her spiritual journey, which is, I wasn't expecting it, and especially from, I've watched the film a lot of times recently, and in the film I think they kind of cut out the spirituality a lot. This is very spiritual. The bit about Italy is less spiritual. I think that's purely just her time of pleasure, but when she gets to India, she goes to an ashram and is very much just practicing meditation, practicing yoga, etc., and it really is all about her spiritual journey and her spiritual awakening and all of this. I enjoyed it. It didn't blow me away. I've still given it 4 stars because of the place it holds in my heart, but I would say this time around it's probably a 3-star read for me. I didn't get as attached to the character. I didn't feel as involved in the story. It was okay. I would still recommend reading this, especially if you are interested in sort of spirituality, because it's very, very interesting look, especially first going into spirituality and sort of the struggles that people can have with meditation and yoga and things like that. But yeah, it's really interesting to reread anyway and just see how far I've come in my life since those days. So that was everything. I didn't get a huge deal read. As I say, Brideshead Revisited took me over a week to read. I'm really hoping that this next month is going to be a better reading month for me, because when my reading's not going well, everything in my life feels like it's not going well. So yeah, hopefully, fingers crossed, things will improve. So yes, that's everything. Bye.